I welcome all of you because it's 9:31 for Psalm 75. And here's something to listen and look for as we begin. And that is Psalm 75 is a psalm that has God speaking. We've seen this before earlier in the Psalms, the voice of God. And it leaves one, needing to interpret what does that mean to hear God's voice. But what's really remarkable for preparation for these classes, I look at as many as 10 commentaries. And in this case, I have at least 5 different ways of discerning what is it that God is saying, meaning almost everybody agrees, as you'll see in a moment, that God starts speaking at verse 3. But when does God stop speaking is subject to interpretation. There are also some rare words in what is a relatively short psalm, but I wanted to read 2 things for background. One from the book of Samuel and Hannah's prayer, and the other a little from Isaiah. And that you'll see these motifs in this short psalm. Here's Hannah praying. We read this as the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah, chapter 2 of the first book of Samuel. And there's 2 key words that I bring to the foreground, and that is horn, karne, which is a word that will appear 4 times in this psalm. And there's a word that only appears in this psalm and in this prayer, and that's the word atak. And by virtue of the rarity, again, just twice, there's clearly a link between this psalm and Hannah's prayer. So let me just read to you these phrases. This is from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. Ramah karni ba'Adonai. I will lift up my horn, Karen, ba'Adonai, through God. This is again Hannah speaking. And then verse 3, she says, talk no more with lofty pride. Al tirbu tidabru gavoa gavoha, yetze atak mi pichem. Let no arrogance cross your lips. Those are her words to the enemy. I'm sorry, this is not Hannah from the, this is right after. Yeah, this is Hannah's prayer. Okay. Now, one other place to read, because it's the other key image of this psalm, and that's Isaiah 5, beginning with verse 11, in which God is speaking. Hoi, mishkimei vaboker, mashkimei baboker. Those who chase liquor from early in the morning till late in the evening are inflamed by wine, who at their banquets have lyre and lute, timbrel, flute, and wine, but who never give a thought to the plan of the Lord and take no note of what God is designing. Assuredly, my people will suffer exile for not giving heed, its multitude victims of hunger and its masses parched with thirst. Assuredly, Sheol has opened wide its gullet and parted its jaws in a measureless gape, and down into it shall go the splendor and tumult, that din and revelry. So here the enemy is described as drunk. Here, verse 22. Those who are so doughty as drinkers of wine and so valiant as mixers of drink, who vindicate him who is in the wrong in return for a bribe, and withhold vindication for him who is in the right. So the evil, powerful people here are mixers of drink, misoch shechar. So the enemy, the arrogant, are drunkards, taking advantage of others. Okay, those are two places where you have these images. They're not the only places. We do get the image of cups, of God describing anger, kos chamato, Isaiah 51:17 describing exile. We get in Psalm 65, yayin tar'ela, the poisonous or the spiked wine. So those are the images. All right, those are some backgrounds to now a shorter psalm that I pick as the title the image of horn and raise. Those are the key words. Raise is repeated 6 times. Horn is repeated 4 times. And for Psalm 75, for the leader, Al Tashchet, a psalm of Asaph, a song. We give thanks to you, God. We give thanks, and near is your name. They recount your wonders. And now, quote, for I will select an appointed time. I with equity, I will judge. Dissolving are the earth and all its inhabitants. Anochi, I am. I have kept firm its pillars. Selah, unquote. I say to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not raise up the horn. Do not raise up on high your horn, speaking with a neck stiffly, for neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the wilderness is one raised up. For God is judge. This one God will bring down, and this one God will raise up. For a cup is in the hand of Adonai, with strong wine, full of mixture, and God shall pour from this. Surely its dregs they shall suck and drink, all the wicked of the earth. But as for me, I will declare forever. I will hymn to the God of Jacob, quote, and all the horns of the wicked I will cut off. Raised up will be the horns of the righteous. So we'll start this psalm. We don't know what prompts it, though ArtScroll will define it as words on the cusp of redemption. And Radak Rabbi David Kimchi will say, what is it that they're giving thanks for? In verse 2, they're giving thanks to God for having preserved the Jews in exile, which would, of course, make this a psalm of prophecy. Again, Asaph, he lives in the time of King David. And so at least the readers of the Middle Ages, in reading this psalm as a psalm of redemption, see it as a prophetic psalm. It is clearly one written from a place in which the psalmist is feeling safe and shaking a finger at those who were corrupt, the boasters. Now, I mentioned, so we give thanks, and near is your name. To say God's name is near is God's name is an intermediary, both for God. When we speak of God, it's as if we're drawing close to God using God's name. And so it works in 2 ways. It means that we are drawing close to God because we're the ones who pronounce the name. It can also be used in terms of God as being close. And here there's a shift from we to they being understood as the people of Israel. They recount your wonders, or they who are loyal, who see you as God, declare niflaot. Kol hanisim v'kol haniflaot. We chant in lighting the Hanukkah candles, niflaot, all the miracles, all the wonders. And now the quote. I choose to see the quote as verses 3 and 4 only. And I do so because of the word Selah. I will say with some satisfaction, I chose to do so in my process of translation, and I was deeply satisfied later to see Adin Steinsaltz do the same, though he is the only other one I saw do it that way. But that's good company and very affirming. Robert Alter, as an example, he goes all the way from 3 to 9. Martin Rosenberg and Bernard Zlatovic in this book, they do it only verse 3. Benjamin Siegel does 3 to 5. Martin Cohen does 3 to 6. King James Version puts quotes in the text. Nonetheless, here's how I see the flow of the psalm. The psalmist hears God's voice. That doesn't mean for me literally. It means that, as we pause to think, what would God say? This is the core message for the psalmist of what God has to say. And this is what God has to say. For I will select an appointed time. With equity, I will judge. And I emphasize all these I's because there are in the Hebrew where the word ani, the fourth word in verse 3, stands alone. It doesn't have to be there. And likewise, even more so in verse 4, the word anochi, right in the middle, that's the fifth word, I am, which interestingly is not usually translated, but it's superfluous. You don't have to have anochi. It could simply be tikanti, I have kept firm. And my sense is what first is being heard? It is God saying, that's the first word of the 10 Commandments, anochi. And I love how Lawrence Kushner understands the first commandment, which is, I am God, you are not. Which is to say, in verse 3 and 4, it's God declaring, I am God, you are not. And who am I? I am a judge of fairness. But I choose the time that I do my judgment. I select an appointed time. Now, this I found also kind of interesting, and that is how the ear of a listener often will translate things a little bit differently. So Art Scroll, it will translate verse 3. No, Mitsuda, which is my little Orthodox translation book, Mitsuda. Look at the verse 3. Instead of for I will set an appointed time, when I celebrate the appointed festival, I will judge with fairness. Because Moed is often a festival. That has a holiday connection that I don't see necessarily there. This rather, verse 3, is God saying, because again, the big issue often in Psalms is like yesterday, when are you going to bring judgment? And here's God's answer. I will select the appointed time. I'll make my own appointments. I, again, emphasizing God's power, the I with equity, because at the center of who God is, it's justice, equity. Yashar, Meshari means with straightness, with honesty, with fairness. Eshpot, I will judge. And now verse 4, Namogim eretz v'chol yoshveha, dissolving all the earth and all its inhabitants. This is also translated sometimes as melting are the earth and all its inhabitants. And so what does this mean, that they're dissolving? The image often used throughout the Torah is of punishment for being sinful. And so some will understand dissolving of the earth and all its inhabitants, meaning things are falling apart in the world. It's as if they're dissolving because of sin. Rashi will see this. Again, the lenses with which we wear. Verse 4 is Mount Sinai. So this is God hearkening back to the pivotal moment of at Mount Sinai, you know, the mountain shook and the people shook, but I kept things firm. So this is again part of self-description. Benjamin Siegel emphasizes with modern lenses that an image used in ancient cosmology is that of the world being liquid and God setting it firm, setting pillars. Those are some ways that these two verses, 3 and 4, are read, but let's return to them. Here's what I hear the psalmist hearing God say: I will choose when I judge, but I do so always with fairness. As I look at the world, it seems to be falling apart. And then at the center, though, I am. And I have kept firm its pillars. I am, despite what may be falling apart, I am still here as God, and I will keep the world stable. And now the rest I read as a commentary of hearing God's voice. And this is now this I, verse 5, rather than being God, is the psalmist. Having heard God's voice, he feels empowered now to continue to address the people around him with the voice of God resonating. I say to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not raise up the horn. Now, this image of the horn, what is the horn? The horn can be negative and it can be positive. 1 Samuel, in that same selection of Hannah, she will refer to Keren Mashiach, the horn of the redemption. Keren Mashiach, verse 10, she will say, Vayarem Keren Mashiach, and let there be raised up the horn of his Messiah, which JPS translates as and triumph to his anointed one. So raising up the horn can be a positive when it's about the Messiah. It's the raising up of pride. The Keren, think of a bull or an ibex, a deer, is the source of its strength, its ability to defend itself, its ability to attack, and its pride. The images I read this as people who are hunters who have the heads up, which is so weird to me, dead animal heads. But what they're showing off is the fierceness of what they have conquered, right? And the horns on the stag hanging on their wall, such a weird image. But here, the horn, do not raise up the horn. Do not raise up your sense of power, of pride, of aggressiveness. Do not raise up on high your horn, verse 6, speaking with a neck stiffly. Now, atak, verse 6, I mentioned, only appears in one other place in the Bible, and that was in this prayer of Hannah. And there it's translated as arrogantly, though Robert Alter emphasizes that its origin, its literal meaning is stiffly, and that's what translators do. A neck stiff, God will often say of the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people, which basically means only going the way you want to go, not taking into account the needs around you. And that's arrogance. And so speaking with the neck stiffly means rigidly, only concerned with yourself. Verse 7, for neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the wilderness is one raised up. And here I share with you something interesting. So we get the east, we get the west, the wilderness is the south, And in the north of Israel are the mountains, Mount Hermon, the mountain that even has snow in the winter. So verse 7 could be understood for directions. But here is something interesting. Now, here's what I'm going to teach you that I learned. You see, the second to last word of verse 7 is Mimidbar, which means from the desert or from the wilderness, Harim. Now, Harim standing alone can either be mountains or raised up, because mountains, right, they're high, they're raised up. The underneath the bet of Mimidbar is what's called a patach. It's the straight line under that second to last word in verse 7 in Hebrew. And Robert Alters points out that vowels came 1,000 years after consonants in the Psalms, right? So the Psalms are written, as is Hebrew normally, without vowels, and 1,000 years after, meaning early parts of the Common Era, the scribes are putting in punctuation of periods and vowels, and they put in what's called a patach, which would normally make this the wilderness of. So it would be the wilderness of mountains, of the mountains. But if instead of being a straight line, that's called a patach, it was a kamatz, which is like under the hay of Harim, that would indicate a pause. So, and not in the desert, then pause. Harim would then become a verb because it'd be standing alone. And that, what's interesting to me is that the standard punctuation is not how every translation I've seen has translated it, except for one, meaning they translate it the way I've translated it, which is from the wilderness is one raised up, because this word harim is mentioned 5 other times. You'll see it here in verse 8 as the last word, yarim, harim. And so choose to see it as a verb. But here's the thing again that I pause. I delighted when Ahuva, in a class last week, did the Ibn Ezra, in which Ibn Ezra, to explain why sanctuaries was in the plural, added a vav to make it the priests, right? The kiddushei instead of. So there's, if you will, adjustments that occur in the classic commentators and in modern scholarship. And here's an example of it. All right, I'll keep going. For a cup, the image of a cup, we saw it, I shared it with you from Isaiah chapter 51. I mentioned in Psalm 60, God gives the poisoned wine. But you can also get the cup in a positive way in other places. So think of Psalm 23, Kosi Revaya, my cup overflows, as if God is giving bounty. But in this case, this reoccurring theme, and here the evil are seen as drunkards, which is why I read from Isaiah 51. For a cup is in the hand of Adonai, with strong wine full of mixture. That phrase is also in Isaiah 51. And God shall pour from this. Surely its dregs, that which goes to the bottom, they shall suck and drink. And here, yimtsu is often translated as they shall drain and drink. But Steinsaltz drew me to this translation of suck. And indeed, that is like motzetz, is for a child, is sucking, which is to imply that they are so gluttonous. They just want to suck it to the very end of what's in the cup, and it's strong wine. They are drunkards. the evil ones. And now the shift back to the psalmist with verse 10. But as for me, in contrast to those arrogant ones, I will declare forever. I will hymn to the God of Jacob. And the last line is what he is both hymning, hence in quotes, but it's also what God has said of God. And all the horns of the wicked I will cut off. Raised be the horns of the righteous, right? With God. And so with, so it's his, God didn't say in verses 3 and 4. It's why some people continue perhaps to have God speaking. It's pointed out by Richard Levy that to cut a horn is a very painful thing for an animal. So all the horns of the wicked I will cut off. It also is a way of saying, I will neuter them, their source, their image of strength and pride. I'll cut it off and instead raise up the horns of the righteous. One more subtle thing in terms of close reading. In verse 11, the wicked is in the plural, and the righteous is in the singular. And toward that end, commentators who notice it say that the wicked act in tandem, and the righteous has to see him or herself as willing to act alone. That to be righteous, you have to be willing to step forward and do what's right, regardless of what others do who are following the crowd. And so to pull this psalm together, 75, there is a sense of the psalmist feeling close to God, close enough to hear God's voice, however you may want to choose for yourself to discern what of this psalm is God's voice. But that's a remarkable quality of closeness. And the key message is when God speaks, I am, period. God exists. 2, I judge fairly. 3, I will choose when I judge. And 4, even though the world is a place filled with corruption, I still exist, and I've created a world that is good, that is firm in its pillars, that will endure even the evil. And last, what flows after is the psalmist's commentary on hearing God's voice. And ultimately, to live as a religious person is to be a commentator of God's presence. However one discerns that presence, in this case, God as a judge of fairness, what religion is about is translating that awareness, that epiphany, that revelation, translating it, which we know is interpreting it, in order to find a mindset of hope that you can find as an individual, not relying necessarily on others, and that leads you to imitate God. And that is to live with faith that the world will endure, that the world is good, and that the corrupt in due time will pay a price. With that as an analysis of 75, I am delighted to see each of you on the screen this morning. I welcome back Mark. It's always a treat when you're here, and Ahuva. It's a treat, and Vivian and Jackie and Barbara, Marion and Shelby. So some reactions to Psalm 75. Ahuva, go right ahead. You got to unmute. Go ahead, Ahuva.
I have several things to note. One is in terms of the quality of this psalm. It seems to me it is very disjointed, and it is quite a potpourri of elements taken from other psalms. It has no uh, logical uh, um, um, how do you say that? Content. It is so here and there and here and there, taken all over. It has no logic in the song. Another thing, going into the individual verses, the word Mesharim in verse 3, it is typically a characteristic of a king. When a new king in Canaan or in the Mesopotamia would come to power, he will describe himself as doing Mesharim, meaning he's going to be a king of justice. So this is his title, sort of a characteristic. So this is probably spoken by a king. It can be God, it can be, but mostly it's a person. As for verse 4, Nemogim, Namog is somebody who is fearful, who is a coward. This is what it's going to be. The whole world is going to be fearful of whoever. I don't know if it's the king of God. It's very unclear.
So I'm going to stop you there, but you can keep going. I just want to be able to react to Ahuva, and you've made three insightful points. The first thing, I'm going to work backwards, is in verse 4. And again, I see verses 3 and 4 as God speaking. The word Namogim, which Ahuva is identified as somebody who's a coward or fearful, the place that it resonates from is the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15:15, in which, as part of that song, the Canaanites, who've heard of God's wonders, it said of them, Namogu kol yoshvei Canaan. So they were all the residents of Canaan, which JPS translates as aghast. But so that's how JPS translates it. Okay. But I actually did have this so they are cowardling the earth and the inhabitants, as if. But going now to Ahuva's first point, what there is in this psalm, as she says, it's not linear. There isn't a sense of a logical flow. But what there is in this psalm are references to key moments. So Namogu, it's not a word widely used, is in reference to a response to God's wonders at the Song of the Sea. Just like quoting Hannah's prayer, which again is resonant here with that word atak, is saying that the psalmist, this is after Hannah here, she's going to have a child. She's celebrating. That's her celebratory song. So there's this, and so likewise Namogu is a celebration of the sea. So what the psalmist is conjuring or free associating to here is an emotional sense of celebrating God's power and the deliverance of the psalmist. And that too is an aspect of poetry, of a religious psalm, these selected echoes of the past. And the last comment that you shared, Ahuva, and that's the word Mesharim, which again is in verse 3. Ani Mesharim, which can be I am equity, or I with equity, and that the quality of Mesharim, which is in the plural, is a royal we, sort of speaking, or a royal I, meaning it's a sense of authority in terms of God is the God of straightness, but in this big way. And in that sense, as Ahuva says, often is a signet of a ruler in the ancient world, both a sign of power, but also of worthy of respect. I use my power for equity, for justice. Ahuva, anything else?
Yeah.
And then Vivian.
Verse 7,
Yes.
you talked about Mimid Baharim.
Yes.
If you notice, it's a kind of poetic verse, and sometimes in poetic verse, especially at the end of the verse, you have Mimotza, Mimara, Mimidbar, and at the last one, the fourth one, comes without the me. And this is a type of poetic way of saying, instead of me, there is as though he put an M dash and he put Harim without the me. There should be a me there.
So if there was a mem at the beginning, in verse 7, it would be from the desert, from the mountains, which again could be from the south and from the north. Here's one other commentary.
Now, Harim is the north, is where the El is.
Right. So again, it's a wordplay, or at least an ambiguity, which may be intentional. Because, by ambiguity, you can say two things at once. It's to say God is everywhere, south, north, east, west, or here, simultaneously, it can be God is from the desert and lifts us up, sees the last word as a verb. Rosenberg and Zlotowitz, these guys, big, thick book, they interestingly point out something else about this notion of why, as they would read it, wilderness is raised up without acknowledging north. And they would say for the following reason: Jerusalem historically is never attacked from the north. It's not attacked from the north because the northern part of Jerusalem has mountains, making it hard to attack Jerusalem. And they added, there's 3 strong walls that were in the north to protect Jerusalem. Hence, it's left off. They have attacked, it will not be from the east, the west, and the south. And they don't even have to mention the north because there are no attacks from the north. So that's perhaps homiletical, but perhaps not. Again, that's the power of poetry, is possibility.
And but Harim is not a verb.
Well, it can be.
It's never a verb.
It can be liharim, to raise up. So I'll bracket that, and you know more than I do about grammar, but at least that's how Robert Alter describes it. He describes it as an infinitive by virtue of separating from desert. Okay, last comment, and I'll leave that one with respect for Ahuva as a question mark. Vivian? You got to unmute.
I would like to thank both of you for helping me understand this difficult psalm, and offer particular thanks to what you say about translation in the Hanukkah season, because as a translator myself, I find that it's part of what we do. We make something apparently disjointed and unconnected and meaningless into something that would make sense for our community. And in another sense, you use the word light to bring light to it. So thank you. May it be that we can translate 2020 into something that will bring light to us.
Thank you, Vivian. And again, we're reading the psalm this week as the vaccine begins to roll out, and a sense of hope after 9 months. And it's a delight to again share the psalms with each of you. And I just marvel at the talent on the screen in front of me. And in Vivian's case, as a translator, a sensitivity to language, and that each person here, and again, thank Ahuva for her learned comments today, brings a different lens and perspective that we bring together to our reading of Psalms. And the magnificence of Psalms, as Vivian explains, is that sometimes things are presented in disjointed ways, not linear, to give the space in the in-betweens for various possibilities that enable for various interpretations, and ultimately for the possibility of saying more than one thing at once. And to pull this together, Psalm 75 is remarkable in many ways. For me, for the echoes of the past for the psalmist, for the prayer of Hannah, for the song of the sea, and for his own hearing God's voice close and calling on the psalmist to thereby interpret that voice and translate it into action. With that, I invite those saying Kaddish this morning to join together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam ome'al maya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'el kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'romav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'el kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Next week, I'm going to do Psalms just 2 days, on Tuesday and Wednesday, but Tuesday is an 80-verse psalm. It's very long. I will start it this afternoon, which is to say on Tuesday, I will look to go 15 minutes longer so as to be able to do it justice, but just Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Tomorrow, Psalm 76, as we go into the second half of Psalms, bring tribute to the Awesome One. Some call, Benjamin Siegel entitles it Pax Jerusalem, a sense not unlike 75 of a time of peace. So Chanukah Sameach, Chag Urim Sameach to everybody. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you tomorrow. Be well.